Anne Boleyn was not born to be a queen. She arrived at the English court, a young woman fresh from the sophisticated courts of Europe. She possessed a certain spark, an intelligence that captivated many. Her dark eyes, her stylish French fashions, and her witty conversation set her apart. She wasn't conventionally beautiful by Tudor standards, but she had something far more potent: charisma. Men were drawn to her, and women watched her closely, some with admiration, others with envy. She knew how to play the courtly game. The Tudor court was a place of vibrant colours, music, and constant intrigue. Anne, with her continental polish, understood this perfectly. She wasn't just another pretty face. She had ambition. She had learned much during her time in France, serving Queen Claude. She brought back an allure that was both exotic and exciting. This wasn't a woman who would fade into the background. Anne Boleyn was destined to make her mark, for better or for worse. Her family, the Boleyns, were ambitious too. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat, eager to see his children rise. Her sister Mary had already caught the king's eye, becoming his mistress for a time. But Anne was different. She wasn't content to be a fleeting fancy. She aimed higher. Little did anyone know this fascinating woman would change the course of English history forever. King Henry VIII was a man obsessed. His primary concern was securing the Tudor dynasty with a male heir. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter, Mary. But daughters, in Henry's eyes, were not enough to guarantee a stable succession. He needed a son. This wasn't just a personal desire, it was a matter of state. The Wars of the Roses, a bitter dynastic struggle, were still a relatively recent memory. The fear of another such conflict loomed large in the minds of the English nobility and the king himself. As his infatuation with Anne Boleyn grew, so did his conviction that his marriage to Catherine was cursed. Catherine had been his older brother Arthur's wife first. Marrying a brother's widow required a special papal dispensation which they had received. But now, Henry began to question its validity. Was this why God was denying him a son? He pored over biblical texts, particularly Leviticus, which stated, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless." This became the cornerstone of his argument for an annulment, what became known as the King's Great Matter. The Pope, Clement VII, was in a difficult position. He was effectively a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Granting Henry's request would anger Charles immensely. Finally, after years of legal wrangling, political maneuvering, and a seismic break with the Church of Rome, Henry got his wish. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was declared null and void by his own Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. He had already secretly married Anne Boleyn. In June 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony. It should have been a moment of triumph. She had achieved what many thought impossible. She was queen. But the crown, when it finally rested on her head, was heavy. Heavy with expectation, and heavy with the animosity of many. The English people were, by and large, not thrilled. Catherine of Aragon had been a popular queen, devout and dignified. Many saw Anne as an interloper, a homewrecker, and the cause of the king's shocking break with the Pope. They called her names in the streets, the Great Whore, Nanny Boleyn. Anne was intelligent and reform-minded, a supporter of the new religious ideas sweeping Europe. But her sharp tongue and perceived arrogance did little to endear her to a public still loyal to Catherine and the old ways. The most pressing expectation, of course, was to provide a male heir. This was the entire justification for the upheaval Henry had caused. In September 1533, Anne gave birth. The court held its breath. By early 1536, the atmosphere around Anne Boleyn had turned decidedly chilly. King Henry VIII's ardor had cooled significantly. His eye had already begun to wander, alighting on a new prospect, Jane Seymour. Jane was everything Anne was not: demure, quiet, and seemingly submissive. This contrast likely made Anne's spirited and often outspoken nature seem less appealing to the king, especially after her repeated failure to produce a male heir. The final blow came in January 1536, when Anne miscarried a male fetus. Henry, it is said, turned away from her in disgust, muttering about being tricked into the marriage by witchcraft. The whispers started to grow louder. Anne had always been a divisive figure. Those who had opposed the break with Rome and those loyal to Catherine of Aragon and her daughter Mary had never accepted her. Now, with the king's favour visibly waning, her enemies sensed an opportunity. They began to feed Henry's growing dissatisfaction, planting seeds of doubt about Anne's fidelity. It was a dangerous game, but the potential rewards, the removal of a queen they despised, were immense. Enter Thomas Cromwell, a blacksmith's son who had risen to become Henry VIII's chief minister. He was a man of formidable intellect, ruthless efficiency, and unwavering loyalty to the king, or perhaps to the king's interests as Cromwell perceived them. Cromwell had been instrumental in facilitating Henry's annulment from Catherine and the subsequent break with Rome. He had helped Anne rise. Now, it seems, he was prepared to help orchestrate her fall. Cromwell was a master strategist. He understood power and how to wield it. With Anne failing to produce a male heir, and the king's affections clearly shifting towards Jane Seymour, Cromwell likely saw Anne as a political liability. Her continued presence might destabilize the king's new religious settlement and his quest for a secure succession. Whatever his precise motives, he took charge of the investigation against the Queen with chilling thoroughness. The trials, when they came, were swift and decisive. On the 12th of May 1536, Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, and William Brereton were tried at Westminster Hall. Smeaton, having already confessed, likely under duress, pleaded guilty. The others pleaded not guilty, but were all convicted of treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the standard brutal punishment for traitors. It was a grim precursor to what awaited the Queen and her brother. The outcome seemed predetermined. Justice, it appeared, was a secondary concern to the king's will. 3 days later, on the 15th of May, Anne Boleyn and her brother George, Lord Rochford, faced their own trial in the King's Hall of the Tower of London. The Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, presided over the proceedings. Anne, the once proud queen, now a prisoner, faced a panel of her peers, many of whom were her known enemies or men eager to please the king. She was not allowed legal counsel. She had to defend herself against charges of adultery, incest, and plotting the king's death. In the days following her condemnation, Anne awaited her fate within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London. Her execution was initially scheduled for the 18th of May, but it was postponed. This delay must have been an exquisite form of torture. Perhaps Henry was wrestling with his conscience. Unlikely. More probably, it was to allow for the arrival of a special executioner from Calais in France. Anne, it is said, had requested to be beheaded with a sword, in the French fashion, rather than the clumsy, brutal English axe. A small, final assertion of her dignity, perhaps, or a last desperate appeal to the king's memory of her continental sophistication. Henry granted this request. The swordsman was renowned for his skill. His arrival added another layer of grim theatre to the unfolding tragedy. Anne, meanwhile, prepared herself for death. She reportedly displayed remarkable composure, even moments of dark humour, joking about her little neck. She attended Mass and received communion, maintaining her innocence to the very end. Was Anne Boleyn truly guilty of the crimes for which she was executed? Or was she a victim of a royal cover-up sacrificed for the king's pursuit of a male heir? Historians today believe Anne was innocent. The evidence was flimsy and obtained through coercion. Her downfall was swift, suggesting a predetermined outcome. It reeks of foul play. Consider the key players. King Henry VIII, desperate for a son, turned against Anne. His infatuation with Anne had soured. Jane Seymour was waiting in the wings. An annulment was complicated, but execution offered a clean break. It also served as a warning to others. Henry married Jane Seymour just 11 days after Anne's execution. Thomas Cromwell, a ruthless political operator, saw her removal as necessary. Anne Boleyn's execution on the 19th of May 1536 was a shocking event. It sent ripples of fear throughout the Tudor court and beyond. A Queen of England, tried and executed on dubious charges, it was almost unthinkable. In the short term, it allowed Henry VIII to marry Jane Seymour, who finally gave him his longed-for male heir, Edward. But the ghost of Anne Boleyn and the manner of her death would linger. Her story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the king's absolute power and the perilous nature of life at the Tudor court. The most significant and lasting impact of Anne's life, and indeed her death, was her daughter Elizabeth. The child Henry had initially dismissed as a disappointment would go on to become Queen Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs. Elizabeth, a shrewd and intelligent ruler, never forgot her mother. Though she rarely spoke of Anne publicly, her mother's tragic fate undoubtedly shaped her own approach to marriage and power. Elizabeth chose never to marry, perhaps wary of the dangers that marriage had brought her mother. She ruled in her own right, a powerful queen who owed her throne indirectly to her mother's ambition. Anne Boleyn's story has continued to fascinate people for centuries. She has been portrayed as a villain, a victim, a Protestant martyr, a feminist icon. Her tale is one of ambition, love, betrayal, and tragedy.